Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is Realism in Art and Literature, Through a Glass Darkly. For now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then shall I know, even as also I am known. Corinthians. Hi everybody, and this is one half of today's talk, Erich Auerbach. And his book here, this is the one he's most famous for. He was a very well-known, renowned philologist, in other words, an historian of literature. And this book, its subtitle, as you can see, The Representation of Reality in Western Literature. And it's a brilliant, brilliant book. It's just under 600 pages. It's a tough read, but it's beautiful. And part of the reason, ironically, is it was published in 1946, but he was a German Jew, so for obvious reasons he had to escape Germany. And he spent his time in Istanbul and wrote this book, and I think I'm right in saying he didn't have access to proper libraries as he would have done back in Germany. So whilst he does quote from the books he had available to him, it's partly from his own memory of huge tranches of literature, but he doesn't get bogged down in the specifics. He's able to range across centuries and talk about his love of literature. And I think the fact he didn't have access to huge libraries actually benefits the way the book flows. And it makes me laugh when I see the word mimesis, because there was a cartoon, I think it was in the 1950s, and not that I'm that old, I hasten to add, but when I was growing up they still showed it from time to time, Pixie and Dixie, and there was a character, was it Mr. Jinx? And he had this catchphrase, "I hate you Mises to pieces," Pixie and Dixie being the eponymous mice, or Mises. So that always reminds me when I hear the phrase mimesis. But mimesis means two basic meanings. The secondary meaning is from zoology, where it's when an animal mimics, or a creature mimics another aspect. So I think it might be mimesis when, on the wings of a moth, they have eyes to scare off predators. I think I'm right in saying that. But its main meaning, I'm distracting myself with ramblings about zoology now. Its main meaning, it's the notion of the imitative representation of the real world, but in art or literature. So it's the whole basic notion of representation. So in art painting would be the classic example. On a flat surface, you're representing the three-dimensional external world, and we'll explore that as we go along. So 1946 was when this book came out, but I'll also be referring to an essay he did in 1938, I think it was, called Figura, this notion of the figure, which sounds simple. Figures, we use the phrase all the time, but it's actually quite complicated. And what I'm going to do is offset Erich Auerbach here with someone who was not related at all, but Frank Auerbach, who was German as well, also Jewish, and it wasn't on the Kindertransport, but his parents managed to get him into England and to safety in the 1930s, and he spent the rest of his life so he basically anglicised. And I've got a lot of sympathy for him, because he basically, like me, was a misanthropic shut-in, but he hardly ever left his studio by Mornington Crescent in London. And we'll see later on he did loads of paintings of Primrose Hill and Mornington Crescent. And I just thought this was a beautiful photograph, because it's a self-portrait of him in the background. So sadly he died only a year ago. Sorry, that should say 2024. Idiot me. He wasn't -7. Apologies. But 2024 he died, and this was taken in, I think it was 2002. It's him in profile with a self-portrait. And just to give you a sample, so we'll be looking at his paintings in detail. So this is the thumbnail, and I'll be talking about, I think the technique's called impasto, this thickness of the paint. And these are all just examples of, I think they're stunning. And this particular one is my absolute favourite. I showed you the others to show you how it's derived. If you saw that straight off, you may not realise it's, a reclining figure. But once you know that, I think it's absolutely brilliant. And I hasten to add, I'm not the type of person who normally likes this type of art. I'm a bit more boring and traditional. But this is something Frank Auerbach himself said. He talked about a sort of magic in conjuring up a real place, a record of it that is somewhere between one's feeling about the facts and the appearance. Well, more than appearance, substance. So I've italicized and emboldened this phrase, these phrases, this concept whereby the notion of reality, talking about representation and realism. He's talking about, you've seen just examples, and I'll show you many more examples from his work. You've seen already examples on how realism isn't really a phrase you'd use to describe them, except this is what he was trying to do. He was trying to conjure up a real place, a record of it that is somewhere between one's feeling about the facts and the appearance. Well, more than appearance, substance. And I think what I really, really like about Frank Auerbach is the substance of his paintings, literally and metaphorically. And that distinction itself between the literal and the metaphorical is important, as we'll see. But you've already seen the impasto effect, the layers and layers of the oil paint leads to quite a stunning effect. But I want you to remember this phrase, somewhere between, and this relationship, conjuring up a real place. This idea of conjuring up, it's both real and it's conjured up. It's from a non-real place, but it has aspects of the real, and it's somewhere between this. I'm trying to think of a good word. The horrible phrase that was used in social sciences, liminal. This place between two places. But it reminded me what he was trying to do, this notion of substance. This is from Ovid's Metamorphoses. It's the section Book 15, Pythagoras. And the verses go, and as the pliant wax is stamped with new designs, does not remain as it was before, nor keeps the same form long, but is still the self-same wax. And in this particular section from Ovid, Pythagoras is wittering on about metempsychosis, or the transmigration of souls, or as we probably know it better today, reincarnation. And I just like this idea that the substance of reality, as the pliant wax is stamped with new designs, does not remain as it was before, nor keeps the same form long, but is still the self-same wax. And there's the waxy element. That this quote just reminded me directly of Frank Auerbach's work. But to talk about Erich's work here, so I've mentioned Mimesis is 1946, and it's a huge, complex book, but just to give you a sample of what it's about, and I want to try and outline why it's relevant to, he was a philologist, a historian of literature. What relevance has that got to do with a painter like Frank Auerbach? And I hope I'll convince you as we go along of why the two, you couldn't call him a creative artist, Erich, but he's obviously deeply involved in critiquing or understanding the creativity of writers. And I hope in the next hour or so to trace for you how you can read Erich Auerbach's work through a completely different medium. And I'm not claiming that visual art can completely explain this mimesis or vice versa. I would argue strongly that there's a unique quality about visual art. I think they call it ekphrasis when you try and write about visual art. Of course, you can approximate, you can write about it, you can talk about it, but there's something ineffable. There's something you can't put into words. That's why it's uniquely painting. But there are resonances between the two, which is the whole justification of this channel. So without more wittering, mimesis, one theme of it is this concept of the separation of styles. And what he means by that is, in classical literature, there was this notion of you could have tragedy. So he talks about Homer and the Iliad and the Odyssey. And these are noble people. And it's all about wars and kings and courts. And in ancient Greek times, you would also have in the theatre satire plays that were crude and bawdy and Dionysian. So they separated the styles. You could have high drama and tragedy amongst noble people, all about fate and character and how the two intertwine. Or you could have lowbrow, rude, priapic comedy. But ne'er the twain shall meet was the idea. And then you have, as Auerbach traces it, what you have this convergence of styles, and the best example of this would be the New Testament. And I don't want to put people off. I've said this umpteen times on this channel. I'm not religious, I'm agnostic. But there is a fascinating aspect, and remember, Erich Auerbach was Jewish, but he's writing about the importance of Christianity from a literary point of view. And he points out that the New Testament brings something new. It's novel, but in an absolutely profound way for Western culture. And how he describes that is, it's present in the Old Testament, the convergence of styles. So that it's psychologically, even in the Old Testament, it's much more ambiguous and nuanced than the more declarative, relatively simple statements of action that occur in epics like Homer. So psychologically, there's more depth in the Old Testament. And by the time you get to the New Testament, you've got this idea that Christ came down to earth, was incarnated as a key concept that I'll talk about shortly. But Christ came down to earth and was humbled in various ways. So he was the son of a carpenter. He ends up being crucified. So this God head, this God made human, according to the New Testament, was also put in quite humbling situations. And that, it's not the comic, but it is the low, the humility, the humbleness, and the God status are combined. And this is unprecedented. This brings a new dimension to literature. And Auerbach traces this, one of his favourite authors. He also wrote this book, Dante, Poet of the Secular World, before Mimesis. And hopefully at a future day we'll get into some Dante, because absolutely stunning writing. But he also says Dante's talking about Catabasis going down into hell in the Divine Comedy, and also eventually being redeemed. So it's about transcendental religious themes, but also there's a very earthly quality to Dante. And again, it's this notion of the convergence of styles. And this is the key thing I want to pick up on, his concept of Figura. There's an essay in 1938 that he wrote. And what's crucial from Figura, the figural and the figurative. The figurative you should be familiar with. So anything that's metaphorical in language or non-literal, allegorical, symbolic, these ways of being non-literal are referred to as being figurative. And that is, if we just deal with the figurative for a second, the figurative is fascinating, because if you think about it, it's innately paradoxical. a literal description of something, just a factual description of something, despite the fact it's literal, can be lacking in detail or can be a bit insipid. But the minute you introduce figurative qualities to language, you start making analogies, similes, metaphors, allegories. You're adding flesh onto the bones of language in a way. You're making reality seem more alive. You're infusing reports about reality, not with dry literal descriptions, but you're imputing and infusing a description of reality with detail and with imagination. So in terms of realism, figurative language is non-literal, yet it can make descriptions come alive and seem more realistic. And I'd suggest in art, there's always this paradox. Art is innately unrealistic because it's non-literal. Its bread and butter is being figurative. Yet, as we'll see with Frank Auerbach's work, it also captures the essence of reality in a way that only literal descriptions cannot hope to. And so now to get to the figural, I'll give you the definition that exists in Erich Auerbach's work later on. But he basically means the figural, as he's using it in a technical, philological sense, is the idea that an event or person exists at one point, and then a second event or person is a fulfillment of the first. So it's like a prophecy, and then the prophecy comes true. And Auerbach argues that the first instance event or person is real and exists, and so does the second. But the relationship between the two of them as some type of fulfilled prophecy, a notion of a second coming. The obvious example is Christ as the New Testament seen as the fulfillment of the Old Testament. Christ being seen as the promised Messiah that all the Old Testament prophets referred to. That would be an obvious religious example. But what I want to show you with Frank Auerbach's work and literature in general, I'll be referring to Proust and James Joyce and Virginia Woolf, these type of modernist writers, there's an element of the figural in their writing too. It doesn't just have to be about religion. So to illustrate this with reference to Frank Auerbach's work, I'm going to suggest that the figural, this idea that the reoccurrence of figures from the past reappearing in a new form, and just to repeat, the figural implies there's a relationship, but the two are separate entities of reality in history. We'll see how Frank Auerbach's work involves the influence of past artistic masters, but he recreates in his completely novel way this influence. So I'm suggesting he creates figural art. And then there's figures from his studio. He had this unique work method. Well, not unique, but he took it to the nth degree. Those layers, those thick layers of paint you've already seen, he would have people sit, numerous times a week for weeks on end, and he would repeatedly keep slapping on the paint. And nearly always, by the end of the session, that wasn't the finished version. He'd scrape all the paint off the canvas, and the next time he'd start again. And then there'd come a point when he'd finally be happy with what he'd done. But this could take absolutely weeks. And he tended to know the people who were sitting for him. He was very familiar with them. So, and I've already given the example of reality as a wax seal in one of the previous quotes. But a lot of the paintings are referenced as EOW, which was Estella Olive West. And she started off as his landlady, and then she was significantly older than him. I can't do the maths or remember the precise ages. I think there was probably about a 17-year difference between them. Apologies if I've got that wrong. but started off as a landlady, turned into his lover, and then she was replaced as she got significantly older by JYM, is referred to in a lot of his paintings, and that's Julia Yardley Mills, who started off as a model and later became his wife. And this is an example of the messiness of his studio. So he said, I think all good painting looks as though the painting has escaped from the thicket of prepared positions and has entered some sort of freedom where it exists on its own and by its own laws, and inexplicably has got free of all possible explanations. Possibly the explanations will catch up with it again, but never completely. Now, I've quoted you this because I'm going to try and argue as we go along that Frank Auerbach's work illustrates certain aspects, like, for example, this concept of the figural from Erich Auerbach. Having said that, I'm completely aware of the difficulty of using visual art to try in some shape or form define writing or vice versa. The relationship is too ambiguous. It's not a one-for-one correspondence. So I wanted to quote this just to show that I'm fully aware of that. But then it also doesn't mean there are no resonances. Where you see relevance and significance, I think it's valid to point it out. But often this resonance and significance are associations. They're not clear-cut. It's not like science. These aren't equations we're talking about. But just to give you, this is Erich Auerbach's Mimesis from that book. I'm giving you the definition of the figural. Figural interpretation creates a connection between two events or persons in which one signifies not only itself but also the other, and that one is also encompassed or fulfilled by the other. The two poles of the figure are separate in time, but they both also lie within time as real events or figures. Both figures are part of the ongoing flow of historical life. Only the act of understanding, the intellectus spiritualis, is spiritual. I think I've referenced this as Mimesis. I actually think this is from the essay Figora, so apologies for that. But he uses part of this definition in Mimesis. I think that's what's led to the misattribution. So I'm just giving you this as his technical description of what the figural means. So just to repeat, the figural interpretation creates a connection between two events or persons in which one signifies not only itself, but also the other. And this is what's crucial. I'm going to argue as we go along that the relationship between these two separate things mean that the figural is more significant than the figurative. The figurative, for example, an allegory or a metaphor, you're using one thing to reference another thing, but it's the thing or the image or the comparison, the analogy, the simile, all these figurative ways of speaking or writing that you're using, those analogies or similes or figurative phrases are subordinate to the meaning you're trying to express. With the figural, there's a relationship between the two things in art or in history, but there's also the significance of the relationship of these two independent things. One isn't subordinate to the other. So figural interpretation creates a connection between two events or persons in which one signifies not only itself, but also the other, and that one is also encompassed or fulfilled by the other. So there's an innate relationship between the two. The two poles of the figure are separate in time, but they also lie within time as real events or figures. Both figures are part of the ongoing flow of historical life. But this spiritual act must deal with each of the two poles in their given or desired concrete reality as past, present, or future events, respectively, and not as abstractions or concepts. These are completely secondary, since both promise and fulfillment are real and concrete historical events that either occurred in the incarnation of the Word or will occur in the second coming. Now, I just want to re-emphasize, this is using quite religious language, but it's also somewhat independent of religion. I think this applies to art as well. So, and not as abstractions or concepts. So, this second paragraph is crucial. The spiritual act must deal with each of the two poles in their given or desired concrete reality as past, present, or future events, respectively, and not as abstractions or concepts. I'd ask you to remember that phrase, and not as abstractions or concepts, because one aspect of that that's relevant for today's world is the way in which ideology has taken over. And part of Auerbach, you remember he's writing in 1946, so we didn't get to see some of the ideological craziness that we've got today. But part of the argument of Mimesis, the book, is that if you learn to understand how past literature made sense to the people of the time, it would help us realise how historically specific our understanding of events are today. And part of the problem of people being ideological is they adopt abstract concepts and they don't see through to the lived reality of those concepts fully. So they fail to see how people thought differently in different previous times, for example. And if you're more sensitive to this idea of the incarnation of the word, the way in which words can be used to describe reality, and of course words are separate to reality, but they also inform reality. They also have a relationship. They can also make prophecies and partially be fulfilled or denied in future. So this notion of the second coming, we'll see with relation to literary artists like Virginia Woolf and Marcel Proust in particular. Proust, I think Auerbach talks about. He talks about both Virginia Woolf and Proust, but he also did a separate essay I'll be quoting from on Proust. And this idea of James Joyce also, the incarnation of the word. Both Proust and Joyce had this strong belief that as writers, they were making reality come alive. And this is the point I'm making. You don't have to be religious to see a certain Christian quality to literary work. It's mirrored in the story of Jesus being the incarnation of God. And this is what Auerbach, as a Jewish person, was writing about. There's a unique quality to literature that the New Testament is the perfect example of. But just to repeat yet again, you don't have to be religious to see this, the role of the incarnation of the Word. So to give you a very specific example, which I will get away from religion in a second, but this is just to give you a practical example of how it works with religion. So this is George Herbert was one of the metaphysical poets, English poet. And this is a small verse stanza from the poem The Sacrifice from 1633. O all ye who pass by, behold and see, man stole the fruit, but I must climb the tree of life to all, but only me, was ever grief like mine. I think what was ever grief like mine is the refrain all the way through the poem. But this idea, man stole the fruit, so there's a reference to the Garden of Eden, but I must climb the tree. And this is an example of the Figural. You've got the Old Testament story from the book of Genesis of Adam and Eve and eating from the tree of knowledge. And then you have in the New Testament, Christ comes down to earth and is crucified on the crucifix. So there's this implication, but I must climb the tree to atone for the stealing of the fruit. And they're both separate theological events. Adam and Eve, the book of Genesis, and the New Testament, and Christ being crucified. Two separate events. And yet, the relationship between the two, as is referenced in this poem, creates what I would suggest is the figural in art, in literary art. It's this relationship of two isolated events that nevertheless have this relationship. And it gives, I think this is the perfect illustration of that poem, which is Salvador Dali, Christ of St. John of the Cross from 1951. Now, if I can give you an example, because we'll be doing Proust in the new year. So this is Erich Auerbach's essay from 1927 on Proust. So he's talking about remembrance of things past or in search of lost time. It's both translations are used. Next to it, almost all the novels that we know seem to be no more than novellas. Remembrance of things past is a chronicle from memory. In it, the secret and often disregarded links between events take the place of the empirical sequentiality of time. Looking back and also deeply into himself, Proust's biographer of the soul, the narrator Marcel, perceives these links to be the real ones. The events that lie in the past no longer have any power over him, and he never acts as if things that happened long ago have yet to happen, or that decisions made long ago still remain to be made. So I've emboldened and italicized that phrase: the secret and often disregarded links between events take the place of the empirical sequentiality of time. So I gave you a religious example, Book of Genesis and the New Testament. But in Proust's work, this is what Auerbach is suggesting. It's not about the empirical sequentiality of time, which is just a convoluted way of talking about the way time normally passes as we think of it chronologically or mathematically or via a calendar. He's talking about the secret and often disregarded links between events. That what is this relationship? And in Proust, it's figural. Things happen, for example, when you're a child and you're not in control as an adult of how these thoughts suddenly reappear. So in that very minor prosaic sense, involuntary memories for Proust are like a second coming. So I'm sorry to belabor the point, but the relationship between the Old and the New Testament is a obvious religious example of figural literary qualities. But in Proust, and we'll see Joyce and Virginia Woolf, these type of writers, the figural is also present in their work in relation to memory. So still talking about Proust, it is for this reason that there is no narrative tension, no peripeteia, no raging and looming of events that find resolution and peace. Peripeteia is a technical phrase for a change of circumstance or a reversal of fortune that might take place in a novel or a play. No raging and looming of events that find resolution and peace. This chronicle of the inner life flows along with a kind of epic uniformity, for it is only memory and self-examination. The novel is the authentic epic of the soul. Truth itself ensnares the reader in a long, sweet dream in which he suffers a great deal, to be sure, but in which he also enjoys a release and a sense of calm. This is the pathos of the earthly course of events, a real, inexhaustible and ever-flowing pathos that at once oppresses and sustains us without end. So I think what Auerbach's pointing out here is one of, I mentioned the paradox of figurative speech, figurative language. It adds flesh to the bones of reality. I've italicized there the earthly course of events. Proust, In Search of Lost Time, is this seemingly rambling, irrelevant work of literature, but arguably it's the most psychologically accurate novel ever written, or one of them, because it reflects how memory works in such an accurate way. So it's the ramblings of one particular narrator, but it's a brilliant description of the earthly course of events. Similarly, this is someone talking about Auerbach, but this is about Flaubert. Flaubert's narrative makes us reach for two mutually exclusive categories, the tragic and the comic, even as it reveals the inadequacy of both. The purpose of the novel seems to be to effect precisely this, that is, to point out the shortcomings of those categories through which reality typically reveals itself. But the novel's realism derives from the ongoing presence of both the tragic and the comic, not from a third category which transcends them. And I've quoted this because it's important. In philosophy, this is the difference in philosophy and literature. Philosophy, some philosophy at least, influenced by Hegel, there's the concept of the thesis, the antithesis. These two things clash, and you have the third of the triad, the synthesis. And there's a notion of history moving forward in this progressive way. But in literature, no, that's not true. You have the tragic, you have the comic, and life limps along with both qualities. You don't transcend anything. Life is stubborn. So that is the unique quality of art. And that's what Auerbach is talking about. Remember earlier on I talked about the separation of styles that occurred in classical literature. For Auerbach, what's most impressive about literature from Dante onwards, and the New Testament to some extent, is the way in which the comic and the tragic, or at least the humble and the tragic, actually coexist without, you could argue, Christ being resurrected in the New Testament is a resolution. But generally, in literary art since Dante, the tragic and the comic coexist. So this is Auerbach talking about mimesis. So with specific reference to Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, this put the emphasis on the random occurrence to exploit it not in the service of a planned continuity of action, but in itself, and in the process something new and elemental appeared, nothing less than the wealth of reality and depth of life in every moment to which we surrender ourselves without prejudice. So this is crucial. This goes to what I was talking about ideology. For Auerbach, a writer like Virginia Woolf makes you confront psychological reality. And if people were more willing to do that, aided by literature, we wouldn't be as prejudiced and ideological in the way we approach the world, because we'd be more sensitive to the psychological complexity of the world. We wouldn't just use lazy ideology. Now there's one or two more quotes, but then I want to get right stuck into the actual art, because this is all wordy. I want to give you some visual, practical illustrations. So back to Proust. His obsessive focus on just one thing is so intense that it thoroughly recreates the world and does so with no external means. Which is to say, he creates the world by eavesdropping on his own feelings, and then making these feelings and the internal process that a sense impression initiates in him, and this alone, into the stuff of what he represents. Like no one before him, he renders sensuality with utter and concrete veracity. This is why in Proust, phenomena like a dress or a meaningless conversation, which we normally observe in an inattentive or summary way, and by means of a system of hackneyed analogies, suddenly seem surprisingly profound, transformed and renewed, capable of absorbing the entirety of earthly existence into themselves, in spite of, or perhaps better, because of, their apparent artlessness. So this is Auerbach talking about Proust, but I've quoted this because I think it's a brilliant description about how Frank Auerbach's artwork has an effect on people. His obsessive focus on just one thing is so intense. So that's at the beginning. And then the bit I've emboldened, capable of absorbing the entirety of earthly existence into themselves. I think that's a pretty good description of Frank Auerbach's paintings. And this is, the next quote is Frank Auerbach himself talking about his idea of painting. And then I'll get stuck into the actual paintings. What one hopes feeds into the painting is the varying, living, changing matter of life, and one hopes to catch some little corner that one hasn't seen before. After all, what is portraiture except finding new deviations from the norm? You know there's a classic head, and then you look, nothing about the person's head is classic, and it gives you a whole new geometry and a whole new expression, and that's the sort of painting I like, because even Mondrian has that for me. It's got nothing to do with abstract design. It has to do with sensation. So I'm putting forward the idea that Auerbach, Frank Auerbach here, his concept of his trying to capture the sensation of reality, that aspect of realism in art, he sees as sensation. And I think there's a very close parallel with what Erich Auerbach was describing about Proust's approach to writing. But if you look at these comments about the classic head and this concept of feeling the deep sensation, I'm now going to go on a long series of paintings from Auerbach that will hopefully, all those wordy quotes I've just shown you, hopefully this long string of paintings will illustrate or flesh out some of what I've been saying. So this is the head of JYM, 1975 to 6. And this is the head of JYM 2, 1984 to 85. And he just did countless paintings on a similar theme. I did mention he used to do repeated sittings with the same close people. So this is head of JYM 1975 to 76. And this is the thumbnail. This is head of EOW2 from 1961. And I hope you can see from these there's some resonance for you with the quotes I've been using earlier on. So the concept of wax and reality and trying to get the sense of reality, the substance. This is EOW Reclining from 1970. I think this next one is my favourite. And I'd probably have to go into deep psychoanalysis to explain why. But this is EOW on her bed from 1969. And just to give you a sense of the painting as it would be seen in the gallery. Now, if you can think back, the early definition I gave you of the figural in Erich Auerbach's book, Mimesis, this idea of the figural as the second coming or the return of a fulfilled prophecy. There's a series of paintings that Frank Auerbach did that were affected or influenced or prompted by past masters. So I want to show you a series of past masters' paintings and then show you the second coming of these paintings as painted by Frank Auerbach. And I'm hoping, just to repeat, this will give you a practical visual example of some of the wordy literary ideas that Erich Auerbach was writing about. And again, to repeat, there won't be a perfect correspondence, because remember that quote from Frank Auerbach where he's talking about art can't be completely interpreted. But I do hope you see the resonance of this notion of the figural. So this is a Dutch artist, Cuyp, C-U-Y-P, I think it's pronounced like that. It's called River Landscape with Horsemen and Peasants. And when I looked at it lazily the first time, you see the guy with the rifle in the lower left-hand corner. I'm assuming he's firing at ducks or something on the lake, and he's not taking an easy pot shot at the cow lying down. That would be a bit too easy. So there's the original. And this was Frank Auerbach's version, drawing after Cuyp's River Landscape with Horsemen and Peasants, 1991. Auerbach painted this. So this is a slightly enlarged version. And it's like being at the opticians. Do you prefer number 1 or number 2? Number 1 or number 2? This is the famous painting Bellini's The Agony in the Garden. So it's Christ at Gethsemane. And this was Frank Auerbach's drawing of the same. In 1987, I think this was. This is Rembrandt's portrait of Margarita de Guerre. And Rembrandt was a key influence on Frank Auerbach. So this was Auerbach's version. One of my favourite artists of all time, Caravaggio. This is the Supper at Emmaus, 1601. And here you can see Auerbach's drawing. So these were drawings. Now we get into some of the paintings that were directly influenced, and you get to see yet one stage further about the incarnation of a previous past master with Auerbach's Figural second version, which is a different incarnation. So this is Samson and Delilah, Rubens. They estimate 1604 to 14. And this is in 1993. This is after Rubens' Samson and Delilah by Auerbach. So just to make the comparison again. And this goes to, so if you saw this, I think it would be fair to say to most people it would look like child nonsense painting. But this is the point about the figural aspect of art. If you know the original and you see the figural second coming, the relationship between the two is significant. And the corollary of that is, if you live in a society where the link between the past and the present has been lost, or we live in an eternal now where the past isn't deemed to matter, or the lineage of culture doesn't matter, you're losing this. The significance and the relationship between the two. So this is Titian, Bacchus and Ariadne from 1522 to 3. And this is Auerbach. Obviously, it's based on the same thing. Obviously. From 1971. And these are just to give you examples of the sketches he did. I just think, sorry, this is slightly tangential. This is just to show you the process. And I'm just fascinated, given the substance, the impasto, the thickness of his other oil paintings. It's just fascinating to see how he worked in this more abstract method that led to later incarnation. And then this is one of my favourite examples of how you can make sense of at least some abstract art. So this is Rembrandt, Lamentation over the Dead Christ from circa 1635. And then I'm going to show you what would otherwise be a largely incomprehensible painting that once you know of the Figural precursor, this painting by Rembrandt, Auerbach's second coming of this painting makes a lot more sense and has a lot more effect. So this is Titian, Tarquin and Lucretia from circa 1571. And then he did a number of variants on this. Auerbach did. So I think this was 1965, study after Titian 1. This was the same year, I think. This is study after Titian 2, 1965. And then just to show you why I like the oddness of Frank Auerbach's mind, this is a photograph of the famous French poet Rimbaud, and when he was 17 years old. And this is Bellini's masterpiece. It's called The Ecstasy of St. Teresa from 1645 to 52. And it's the altar of the Cornaro Chapel in Santa Maria Vittoria in Rome. So that's the artwork. That's the context. And remember the original photograph of Rimbaud. This is Auerbach's painting. And Auerbach described his own thought process when he did this. He said, rather like the man in Pickwick Papers, in other words, Dickens' novel, who wrote an article on Chinese metaphysics by looking up first China and then metaphysics in the encyclopedia, and then combining his information. The image, in a batty way, made a sort of sense. So that was, if you go back to that, that's the process where he gets to that. And that was another Rimbaud 2, 1975 to 6. And then this one's interesting. This is by Willem de Kooning. So this isn't Auerbach, this is Willem de Kooning, and it's Suburb in Havana, 1958. And then there's a famous art historian, T.J. Clark, and I'm going to give you a quote from his book, where he was at another artist's critic, Michael Podrow. So he's visiting him, and he saw this painting in Michael Podrow's living room. So that's the context of this next quote. It would not have altered things much, incidentally, that if I'd been better prepared in Podrow's living room, I might have seen that the monstrosity on the wall had been made partly out of devouring, destroying other people's art. If I'd been able to glimpse the Kooning landscape... Oh, sorry, I've messed that up. This is the painting that's being referred to, not in the next quote. I'm a naughty, naughty boy. What I'll do is I'll show you. I've done this out of order, so if you'll bear with me. This is the painting that he's seeing on the wall. And this is Primrose Hill, Autumn Morning by Auerbach. And that's the de Kooning that Auerbach is basically, in a way, making fun of. So that's Suburb in Havana. So apologies for that, I've messed that up. So this is the quote, let's see if it makes sense. It would not have altered things much, incidentally, that if I'd been better prepared in Podrow's living room, I might have seen that the monstrosity on the wall had been made, partly out of devouring, destroying other people's art. If I'd been able to glimpse a de Kooning landscape from 10 years earlier, say, Suburb in Havana from 1958, lurking under Autumn Morning, I might have been a little less at sea. But the problem would only have shifted ground. I would still have had to sort out why and how de Kooning's elegant, lavatorial graffiti, his Cuban blue depth, the lavish decisiveness of his foreground V, were turned in the Auerbach into a kind of waterlogged, storm-streaked slipperiness. Maybe I'd have twigged it had to do with the climate of London. Constable smiling. Just as likely, I'd have continued to be thrown by the blatancy of Auerbach's Kill the Father. So that he's suggesting is Auerbach's version of that. That is now as clear as one of Auerbach's paintings, I'm sure. But to get back on track, again to show the influence of Rembrandt, this is Rembrandt, The Three Trees from 1643. And then there's a series of paintings Auerbach did on Primrose Hill in London. And you can see the influence initially, and then it gets more and more abstract and weird. So these are all the Primrose Hill, and then you see some of these sketches, the drawings. I just think it's fascinating to see the skeletal structure of what he later went on to produce. Maybe I'm easily impressed. It's just I'm fascinated by the seeing the process come alive. So these are all the Primrose Hill. This is Primrose Hill Summer from 1968. This is Spring Morning Primrose Hill Study 1974 to 5. Winter Evening Primrose Hill Study 74 to 5. Primrose Hill Spring Sunshine. And again, this concept of the figural, this is obsessive way of going back and producing second comings of the same scene again and again and again. So this is the winter version. And then, just to show you the subtlety of the influence Rembrandt had on him, this is a relatively little known painting. Dr. Ephraim Bueno, Jewish physician and writer, and this is Rembrandt 1647. But if you see a slight impasto effect, there's a hint that later artists like Auerbach really went with. And this is an ink drawing. It's Joseph Telling His Dreams by Rembrandt. And it's the interesting the way in which it's the opposite effect. Rembrandt makes you look into the drawing, the detail, whereas Auerbach makes you see the overall pattern, but you almost like focus away. You don't focus in, you focus out. So this is what Auerbach's The Sitting Room from 1964. So Auerbach said, I don't think one produces a great picture unless one destroys a good one in the process, and one doesn't make a great picture by destroying a rotten one. What I'm trying to make is a stonking, independent, coherent image that has never been seen before. To make something that is as blatantly public and extravagantly new and strange as that, one needs material. And that's what all the subjects are for. They're not there for their own sake. They're not there for sentimental reasons. They're there to feed this new, independent image that one's trying to make, that stalks into the world like a new monster. And I love that description that accounts for this weird mix in Auerbach paintings between the familiar, because he was very familiar with the people who were sitting for him, and the monstrous appearance. And it's like the convergence of styles, referring back to the Erich Auerbach, the idea of the high and the low, the tragic and the comic coexisting together in this convergence of styles. So this is the new monster, the JYM in the Studio 3. JYM Seated number 1 from 1981. Reclining Head of Gerda Baum, 1982. This is another one of my favourites. It'd probably make my top 5. And again, something about reclining images, the way he does them. The Head of Julia, 2, 1985. reclining figure in the studio, one from 1963. Look at the way the oil just like seeps over the edge, encrusted. The frame can't contain it. The head of EOW1, 1960. The head of EOW, 1965. And this is seated model 3 from 1963. And some of the influences were just weird. I think Auerbach himself said he was influenced by Rembrandt, the following painting, that helped him develop the posture for some. You'll see some more along these lines. So this was sorry, it wasn't Rembrandt. This was a Velázquez painting, Sebastian de Mora, from 1644. So this is Velázquez. To Rembrandt, Velázquez, various classic painters influenced him. But from this, he got the overall. And this has hints of Francis Bacon, if you ask me. This is seated figure with arms raised, 1973. The same title, 1974. And this is portrait of Hendrik Stoffel, 1654 to 6. I love pretending I can speak Dutch. Stoffel. But this gave rise to JYM seated, 1976. It's uncanny, the likeness, isn't it? Portrait of JYM seated, 1976 again. Now, this is a good one. Portrait of Catherine Lampert. And he's made this interesting quote. A late Matisse paper cutout. And Matisse, as he was getting older and was ill, he stopped painting, but he, this creative urge, he started doing paper cutouts and pasting them. A late Matisse paper cutout, which seems on the surface and perhaps to superficial or uninstructed viewers to be a decorative pattern, works because it's a shape made from a sense of mass rather than a shape made from a sense of shape, and a disposition made from a sense of infinite space rather than disposition on a flat surface. I think there's a real barrier between the sort of painter who's arranging things on the surface for their own sake and the sort of painter who has a permanent sense of the tangible world. So this is the most famous example, Icarus, 1946, by Matisse. But if you think of that quote, I think arguably an even better example of the meaning behind that quote is that the Blue Nude one from 1952. And then this is Julia Yardley Mills again, JYM 3 from 1980. And this is Head of Catherine Lampert, 1983 to 4. And this you get into the Joker territory, but there's something about, I don't know. Words fail. It's a slightly oblique angle. So I'll just finish with taking it back, this notion of the figural, the reappearance throughout history of independent events that nevertheless are joined in some way or have a relationship. It makes me think of what saddens me about when great literature is no longer read anymore. So Dante would be a good example. No one reads Dante anymore. Very few people. And yet, for Erich Auerbach, to take it back to Erich Auerbach, sorry, not Eric, Erich Auerbach, he said, the importance of Dante for Auerbach is that the poet had never heard of historicism. In other words, this idea, historicism, is the belief that you can only judge things within terms of their own historical period, whereas someone like Dante was writing about, to some extent, universal values that arguably spanned time. So for him, the measure of history was not history, but a divine and perfect order of the world. This doesn't make Dante right and historicism wrong, but it does make Dante's work the ideal challenge to historicist thinking. And we might say the same about the Christian tradition of figural connection, as Auerbach sees it. These ways of making sense of the world are powerfully alien to us, and that is why we need to understand them, especially because we tend to think of them as abstract or ideological or allegorical. Auerbach's recurring argument is that they can give us lessons in concreteness, and he thinks no lessons are more urgently needed. So I've put a link to this article that this is from in the description box. But this actually, the argument is counterintuitive, but by reading Dante, by getting in tune with Erich Auerbach's argument, you actually get a much fuller sense of reality, realism, through history. And what we're living in today is we're alienated from this tradition, the Christian tradition of figural connection, which I've been trying to show you throughout this whole talk. That's what we've lost touch with. But what is concreteness? This is like asking what Auerbach means by reality. It is asking what he means by reality. Reality is, in a first sense, whatever exists or takes place in the world, in the mind. Whatever happens, happens. In a second sense, it is whatever piece of the actual or lived, the experienced or the deeply needed, that a writer or thinker has found words for, or a painter found images for. It's possible to miss the real in this sense, to get it wrong, or not care about it. And I think this is what's relevant to all the writers that I've quoted, Joyce, Proust, all these people, and Frank Auerbach's work, this idea, whatever piece of the actual or lived, all these paintings I've been showing you, the experienced or the deeply needed, that a thinker has found words for, Erich Auerbach, or a painter found images for, Frank Auerbach. It's possible to miss the real in this sense, and that's what I'm claiming we're doing today. To get it wrong or to not care about it. People don't read Dante. Auerbach's larger point is that the real takes many forms in time, that a preoccupation with the real will persist across cultures, even if those cultures stress quite different objects and instances. In any case, there is no other test except our own encounter with the poem or the painting. And the point of Auerbach's criticism is not to force this meeting on us, but to give us the best possible chance of having the meeting happen. So the earthly world that he seems in fact to be talking about in his book, a world that we thought we too knew, and that, as if in a dream, we believe we are found again and keep on trying to identify. This earthly world is made in his book out of some strange, unexplored, and mysteriously concocted substance. So I keep saying Erich Auerbach, he's talking here about Proust and the mysteriously concocted substance that Proust is trying to find. And this mysteriously concocted substance is what I'm suggesting is in, bizarrely, Frank Auerbach's paintings. So whether I've convinced you of that or not, I'm sure I'll hear in the comments. So until the next time, I'll just finish with a few paintings to illustrate from Auerbach this mysteriously concocted substance. So take care, all the best. This is the head of EOW2, 1963-4. I just remember that phrase, mysteriously concocted substance. I think this final image sums that up better than my words can.